Topic here is sound and fury, the discussion for class. For the most part, I am not going to spend too much time in the screencast going over every detail because the discussion is in class for that particular approach. So the question here, why do you think I started with this film? I think I started with this because it's a good way to look at similarities between different groups that are not normally experiencing, examples of racism, however, are still discriminated against, on some level, experiencing some similar issues. By the end of the class, hopefully you start to see some of the similarities between different groups as opposed to looking at the differences. So I'm going to basically just give a couple of scenarios. Your kid is born deaf. Do you get the implant? And for the most part, students in this class, just making this up, I would say, usually I get about 1 to 2 students that'll say no, and then everybody else pretty much says yes. And I'll ask, well, what's the reason for this? And they'll say things like, well, they're going to have a better life. At which point I would challenge that student to say, well, what do you mean by a better life? Since you are part of the hearing majority, maybe it's a result of the majority putting in place mechanisms like inferior schools that create a situation where the deaf community finds a troubling life, basically dealing with the majority group. So in this case, we have the majority, the minority being the deaf community. And so the majority, part of that hearing community, the question here is which group should have to assimilate in the situation? Does the majority have a responsibility to kind of cater and adjust for the deaf community, or is it the other way around? So if we're looking at, I'm making up these numbers like 90%, 10% of the population. So 90% is majority, 10% being the minority. Which one has that particular responsibility? But I always find it fascinating that students will say, well, they're going to have a better life. Well, they're going to have a better life. They're not going to be, discriminated against. They're not going to deal with institutions that are going to hold them back. And I would say, well, maybe that is a result of the majority not creating an environment where those individuals can be successful, and society can, give everybody the opportunity of true equality. So I usually start off with that question and challenge students to think about that. At which point I will then probably shout out and ask, do you think you're better than deaf people? Do you think that you are superior to them? Because if you're going to argue that you have to, that you would get the implant and it's in this parent's best interest to get Heather the implant, then you are making a judgment about the deaf community, about deaf people. And so just trying to challenge you to think about that. If we were to ask the father Peter, I don't think he would say anything about the deaf people being inferior. He is somebody who says that his life started when he learned to sign, and that defines who he is as a human being. And so to think about that, and I'm going to throw in a couple of other scenarios. Again, I'm just trying to make connections here. If we go back to W.E.B. Du Bois, you have, what it means to be an American. Now you have what it means to be a deaf American. You have some of that double consciousness playing out, or are you going to argue, well, race and in this case, the deaf community, you cannot compare the two, or are they dealing with, similar issues? If we go back to Du Bois, he is saying that he had come to this understanding when that girl rejected his card, that at that point, he was different from the others. He was Black in America. Well, how different is that from Peter talking about being deaf in America, or are the experiences just completely different? I know that, they're not going to deal with certain things that are similar, but on some level, there are similarities that you can make. So if you decide to get the implant, is that going to lead to a destruction of deaf culture? And I think the video argued yes. Now, keep in mind, you have the hearing community, you have the deaf community, and now you have this cochlear implant community. And so this experience is very different, and you have created a different group. Their experience is vastly different from the hearing community and the deaf community because they're dealing with struggles that are specific and unique to this particular group. And you could probably do that with any group that we've been talking about throughout the year. Now I'm just going to give you a couple of other scenarios, and I don't want anybody to get upset about these Scenario questions. Your answer, if you are going to argue yes, doesn't make you racist or homophobic. I am going under the assumption that you are making the choice as a parent to have a life that is going to be, full of, not experiencing too many acts of hostility. So let's look at this scenario. It's the year is 1953, and your child is born gay. The doctor has an experimental pill that will make your child not gay. What do you do? So if you're going to say yes, let's assume that everybody's saying yes, they're not homophobic. I want you thinking about this question here from the point of view of being a parent. Like, what concern about the safety of your child? What is going to be the life of a gay male 1953? What experiences of discrimination and prejudice are they going to experience? So I don't want you making your answer, your decision based on you're homophobic, or I don't want anybody to think if you say yes that you're homophobic. Just think about that scenario. What about this one here? It's 1909, and in this case, that there is you and your spouse are black, so now we are dealing with segregation, we're dealing with lynching. Would you get an experimental pill to change the skin color? That's what's going on here. I know it sounds like a very bizarre scenario, and I don't mean to offend anybody with this, but again, is this experience different from this experience? If you're going to say get the cochlear implant, you are making a judgment. You're saying something about the experience of a deaf American similar to the experience of a gay American or a black American living in 1909. About this scenario, you're a Muslim family after 9/11. You live around the corner from the Trade Center attack. Do you hide aspects of your religious identity for safety? So here we're looking at another example where you have a articles of clothing that could identify you as a Muslim. And as a parent, do you tell your child, you know what, we need to mute aspects of that because we are concerned about our safety? And how different is that from, the experimental pills that I used before? What about an Asian American? What do you identify most with in the film? And for the most part, that's it. I just simply want to know where you stand on this issue and to try to make connections to other groups. So we'll probably address some of these in greater detail in class, as I don't want to spend too much time going over every particular item here. So we will be making connections to other groups that, believe that they are experiencing discrimination as well. And if you did not know, Heather eventually does get the implant, and she wound up doing a TED Talk. And so we'll probably watch that in class as well. Again, this is just an introduction to some of the issues, and I'm trying to just focus on some of the similarities, as opposed to focusing on the differences, because the differences are going to divide us and really not going to help ease tension between different groups. So these are your closure questions, and that's it for Sound and Fury.